And I'm Cindy, and welcome to Pearls of Liberty. This week we have our friend Vicky visiting with us, and she's a guest this morning. So Vicky, would you say hello and introduce yourself a little bit?
Hello, I'm Vicky Goodwin. I'm very excited to be here and really looking forward to kicking things around a bit.
That's great. Well, this morning we have a couple things that we want to touch on that we've addressed previously or in our blogs. And we'll just say a little bit about Charlie Sheen this morning. We don't really want to focus on that, but it is such a present topic, and so many people have so many questions and so many opinions. I guess, is it really?
Apparently. Maybe not anymore.
Wow.
For a couple days it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, crazy.
Well, it's because we're not, it's not that we're following celebrities that closely, but because it concerns the truth movement, we kind of feel to some extent like we have a personal stake in this. We root for Charlie, we root for Alex Jones, and we're very much hoping for complete restoration for Charlie. And people question, you know, is he on drugs, is he crazy, or is he black ops? And we kind of have another idea about Charlie, because the two women who he's spending a lot of time with are porn stars. We just happen to know, based on some of the reading that we've done, that porn stars are very often mind control sex slaves. And just in thinking about Charlie, talking about Charlie, it's come to our attention that it's possible that Charlie's not himself under mind control, although he may possibly be, but the women that he's constantly associating with are under mind control and maybe driving him a little bit crazy or directing him certain ways. If you'll read some of the mind control books, Bryce Taylor's book or Kathy O'Brien's book, you'll come to understand the means that the people who control the mind control slaves have of interfering
Not
with
the least
lives.
of which is sex, and the way that they can implant ideas and suggestions in when somebody is in that vulnerable state. So obviously that's part of what's happening. That's a part of Charlie's world that may be throwing him off balance, to say the least. So we're, like Cindy said, hoping for the best, but thinking that this may be a deliberate attempt by people that want to derail Charlie Sheen and the 9/11 truth movement and Alex Jones in general. This may be an avenue of attack that might not even be perceived by most people yet.
So, considering these things, I believe the best avenue for us as people who are seeking truth is to not be dissuaded or thrown off the track by these kinds of things that might come up if someone behaves erratically. If Alex Jones were to, go off the deep edge, that does not detract from the message that he's carrying.
We're supposed to be looking at truth issues anyway, not personalities. This is not about personalities. This is about liberty, and it's about truth. It's about ideas, and not about personalities. So we want to keep that in mind. Absolutely.
So if you, like us, are on a quest for truth and liberty, please don't get sidetracked by some personality story. As Don said, it's not about personalities. It's about being on a quest for the truth. And Christian leaders fall sometimes. Jim Bakker, Jimmy Swaggart. It happens. That does not mean that their message is not valid. It's a personality thing. Anybody can fall, and even the Bible says we all stumble in many ways. So,
Peter fell and he became the Pope. So there you go.
Yeah, but was he a Vatican assassin? That's what we really want to know. So, on a much more serious note, Don has recently come across a Wall Street Journal article that actually discusses the fall of the dollar. And I don't know if we've never really discussed this, but Don does a weekly stock market commentary, and you can see the web address for that on the screen. It's a free commentary, and he does follow the markets fairly closely and keeps a very close watch on what's happening in this country financially. So can you say a little bit about the Wall Street Journal article?
Sure. The article itself doesn't really have that much detail. It's just kind of throwing this idea out there that hasn't been in the mainstream yet, and that is the end of the dollar as the world reserve currency. No, the dollar's not going away overnight. No, you're not going to be getting your dollars replaced with Ameros. Those kind of ideas have been tossed around in conspiracy or end times scenarios for a long time, but the people that are manipulating this game of global finance are a lot smarter than that. They're going to let you keep your dollar, and if they can keep it as quiet as possible that they're making fundamental changes, that's what they'll do. And they are making fundamental changes. That's what the Wall Street Journal points out. They have to get the word out there in the major financial circles so that people don't immediately panic and jump ship and create a backlash that is hard for these global financial controllers to deal with. So they put this feeler out there, and that's really all the article is, talking about the end of the dollar as a world reserve currency. Not even just floating the idea, because that idea is pretty certain to come about, and probably within a relatively short time frame too. So what this really tells us more than a financial strategy is it's a public awareness strategy that the global elites are getting. They're gaining acceptance in their minds in the financial community for what they're planning to do. And once the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, things will begin to go downhill very fast for Americans. That's really been the only thing that has been our saving grace, is that the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and especially because oil is denominated, the purchases all happen in dollars and then converted to other currencies. That's provided some real stability for this country that may very likely go away. And I'm being cautious in my words, but it's almost certain to happen. And it is the strategy of the globalists to bring us down in our standard of living. And that's not something that I think that Americans should willingly accept, but we have to be smart. We can't just think that we're going to change things by rioting in the streets or something. Now's the time to start gaining some financial wisdom about what's really going down. Yes, we want to end the Fed, but what are we going to put in its place? There's all kinds of options. We need to begin a national debate on those issues now. We need to be talking about, do we want to have a commodity-based currency, a precious metals-based currency, or do we want to have some kind of a fiat-based currency that's not managed privately like the private Federal Reserve, but publicly? So there are a lot of options, a lot of people in these different schools that are experts, and we really need to start thinking about these things, because this is going to start happening very, very rapidly. The reason that the oil is and the gasoline at the pump is going up so much in price right now is not because oil is getting more expensive. Yes, of course, you can say, yes, it is, but it's the dollar that is decreasing in value. And yes, the circumstances in the Middle East have something to do with it, but they have actually there's been circumstances where they've made arrangements to keep the oil flow going, but the price of oil keeps going up anyway. So the elites always like to disguise what they're doing to get you looking in the wrong place. And I think that's what they're doing here. Yes, at this point, the Middle East situation stuff really is happening that could destabilize the oil and the price of gasoline. But what's really more fundamental is that more and more nations are getting out of using the dollar. Russia and China now have agreements to share oil or purchase oil from one another without using the dollar as an intermediate currency. This is a new thing that's happening globally, and the ramifications are huge.
You mentioned some of the things that we might consider doing more globally, and by globally I don't mean the globe. I mean universally in the United States to redeem our economy. But if this is coming, do you have any suggestions for how an individual or a family might be able to protect their finances to some extent?
Well, a few major ideas that are pretty much becoming more and more common knowledge are get out of paper and get into precious metals. Silver is a very good thing for common people like ourselves to get into, and we've been doing a little bit of that. And then the one idea that's sort of new to me recently is getting a diesel vehicle, because if we're able to store fuel, diesel fuel can be stored, but gasoline can't. Now, I don't know if it's going to come to that, or if we're just going to be dealing with price fluctuations that are really extreme, but getting a diesel vehicle is a good idea, and getting storable food that maybe prepared meals or maybe just rice and beans and that type of thing that you could live off of for weeks and months. So those are the common sense ideas.
Now, of course, if you have any land at all, this might be a good spring to be planting a garden.
Of course.
And become accustomed to growing some of your own food. I think we've mentioned before that at the time of the Great Depression, something like 85% of people were directly tied to the land in a way that would allow them to grow some of their own food. And now the number isn't it like 4% of people are. So the Great Depression, people were suffering horribly, of course, but they could at least, have some potatoes in their yard and live off something like that, maybe, a little vegetable garden. And so few Americans are doing things like that at this time. So if you have any means, get yourself some good seeds that are not GMO, and learn, maybe this summer, learn how to make things grow that you can eat. And then next year you might be in a better position to...
And don't be intimidated by people talking about laws that you can't grow your own food. There is noise like that out there, but if you're talking about something on a relatively small scale in your own backyard, this is nothing to be concerned about at this point.
Great, good. And of course we're going to be on the lookout ourselves for some locally grown produce. If you can't grow your own food, try to form some relationships, even if it's just a client kind of a relationship, with people who locally grow produce. And I know that our friend Vicky has a couple of different things that she is wise about. She has spent some time in various cultures. She's spent a great deal of time in Mexico, just south of the border, in Juarez, and she's very familiar with that culture. And she's also had occasion to become somewhat familiar with Islamic culture. And one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot lately is, are Muslims really a threat? There's been a lot of buzz that even in larger media circles that Al-Qaeda doesn't exist and never really did exist. And the fear of Islam is used so much to threaten us in this country. And Vicky has some personal experience with some Islamic people that she'd like to share to kind of put us at ease a little. So, Vicky.
I'd love to. I was employed in the southwestern part of the U.S. In a military installation in a management role with a defense contractor whose job it was to provide Middle Eastern civilians as role players, provide them to the military in order to train the soldiers in how to guard detainees. So the military had constructed these mock prisons and villages out in the desert, and then they would give our company a scenario, and we'd bring the appropriate number of people to fulfill the scenario. And when we did detainee operations, it was a couple hundred people at a time sometimes. And the way it worked was we would be out there in the desert for 12, 14 hours at a time. So we had a lot of downtime. And I had the privilege and the experience of getting to know a lot of Muslims and Middle Eastern people. These people were Iraqis and Afghanis. And the first thing that I noticed about the Iraqis, there were a lot of Christians also among the Iraqis. And the first thing I noticed was how well they got along with their Muslim counterparts. And as I began to get to know them and talk to them, I found them to be eager to talk about religion. Very well-educated people. The first thing I went for was, well, why don't you guys like the Jews? I hope I was more diplomatic than that. But, you know, I opened up that topic, and not one single time did I ever find the slightest hint of any hostility or dislike toward Israel. As a matter of fact, they always went back to, we are all brothers because of Abraham. Mm-hmm. And you guys believe this about Jesus and about Abraham and Moses, and we believe a lot of those same things. And I found them to be, on the whole, and I want to say that I know I haven't been to Iraq. I haven't lived in that culture, but I got to know enough of them in number and in depth. I am comfortable saying that as a culture and as a whole, as a people, they are the most kindest, hospitable, giving people. They love to share their food. They love to talk about cooking, and they're just wonderful, sweet people, and very open to talking about Christian beliefs, really wanting to know, what is your holy book, the Bible? What is that all about? And so the reason I think this is important, just real quick side note, I personally don't believe the government version of the explanation of 9/11. I have way too many questions. I can't say for certain I know exactly what happened, but it's really raised a red flag to me when I see the demonization of Muslims in especially the conservative media. I can't explain exactly all the dynamics. I know there are radicals, and the insurgency is real, but I've come to believe the insurgency is funded by the CIA anyway. And so that's why I think this is really important, is these refugees are in our country because we're fighting a war in their country. It's not their preference to come here. Their lives are extremely difficult, and they have stories that are horrific if you would listen to how their journey and how they got here. And so I guess that's really my take on it, is they're just very kind, sweet people, and if you would ever have the opportunity to meet and befriend a Muslim family, a Middle Eastern family, Christian or Muslim, your life would be greatly enhanced. And you'd really enjoy getting to know them. They're wonderful people.
That's great. That's great.
Taking a step back and putting another layer on what Vicky's just said, I think the obvious question is, well, why does there seem to be such hostility? And I'd like to throw out there what Vicky has kind of alluded to, that maybe a good portion of that hostility is manufactured because it serves a purpose. If you go back in wars throughout history, you will find that there are forces manipulating the media to set up the conflict because people will benefit from the conflict. That's unfortunate, but it's true. It's not common knowledge because History is written by the winners. History is written by the people that bankroll those wars. And we're not saying that there are not some wars that need to be fought, but I think one of the things that we've learned is that we have to be really wise about and not come to assumptions that all of these people in this country hate you, because by and large the people are just like us and they want to get along. One of the common beliefs, it seems to me today, about the Middle East and Israel is that there's this hatred and animosity that's been going on for centuries. Well, as Vicky has just alluded to, that's really not true. That's not even true in the way that we think it is today, and it's not true historically. Some of the things that the nation of Israel has done in their recent history since 1948 have exacerbated the problem, and they definitely share some of the blame for inflaming the situation, but it's not as if there is this huge animosity that is centuries old, because the people usually get along with each other. It's the people at the top manipulating the situations in all countries and all ethnic groups that initiate these conflicts and make them to appear much worse than they are.
And you said that people will benefit from wars, and those are the people that you were referring to.
Mm-hmm. The people at the top.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we've mentioned before and emphasized the importance of love. This evil that's in the world works through fear primarily, and we believe that perfect love casts out all fear. And as Vicky's mentioning, you interface with people, you get to know them, you come to love them and value them as people, as individuals, and you no longer want to go to war and kill them. And we think that it's a natural state of man to be fighting and killing. But if you look at the biblical history, Cain killed Abel, but that was, people had been around for quite some time before that happened. And even though man is fallen, and we do have a nature that tends to be selfish and egotistical, most people don't have a desire to kill. In fact, our son, who is a Marine, has told us that in the Battle of Gettysburg, they found rifles that had 6 to 7 rounds in them unfired. And evidently what the troops would do at Gettysburg was they would load their rifle and behave as if they were firing, and then load again, because they didn't really want to kill. And I tend to believe that even though we do have a fallen nature, we're not perfect, we're egotistical. I don't believe that we have a very strong impulse to want to go find somebody else to kill.
People are not murderers at heart. That if you get to know what people are really like, you really don't want to wipe them off the face of the earth. Yeah. Because we're all flesh and blood.
That's great. Vicky, do you have anything else to say about
that?
Well,
I think that she can add more to that subject, but then there was also the thing about drug trafficking that she wanted to address. Yeah.
Are you ready to move into that?
Sure.
Okay. Another culture that Vicky has become somewhat familiar with is the Mexican culture that exists just south of the border in Juarez. And Juarez has come to be known as a rather dangerous city, and there are a lot of drug cartels. Vicky's crossed the border there a lot and done a lot of mission work there, and loves the people there, and has a lot more knowledge about what's going on down there than we do. So can you enlighten everybody about the culture of Juarez and what's happening there?
Well, I guess the first thing you notice when you go there is the economy and how it's just been shut down at the border because tourists are just too afraid to go. to cross over from El Paso into Juarez. A lot of people still do go because they have family there. And some tourists do go. But just the Mexican economy, which has never been stellar anyway, the way that it's been affected these last few years is just devastating, devastating effect on the people's ability to make a living. The factories, there's a lot of factories there, they call them maquilas. The maquilas have been affected by the cartels going in, requiring, they call them quotas, but it's protection money. And if they don't pay, then people who work at the factory come up missing and their heads are found hanging outside the doorway. I mean, that's just common. You know, I don't mean to be extreme in my language, but to describe the situation, it just sounds, it's just horrifying. About 2 weekends ago, I think it was, there were 53 people killed over one weekend. And the cartels, to me, it's just anarchy. It's really difficult for people at our level to even know who's driving what, who's behind which cartel. And basically what they're all fighting for is supply lines north. And so they really do fight it like a war, with terror squads, with executions. The prosecutions that the government has done are minimal. I think one statistic I read said 80-some convictions out of a few thousand arrests. And when you think of the billions with a B, dollars to be made, you can just imagine the never-ending supply of people who are willing to step up and try to take advantage of that and get employed by the cartels. About a year or two ago, one of the cartels printed up handbills, flyers, recruiting people to come and work for them. And one of the things it said was, you know, top-of-the-line equipment, body armor, only the best weapons, and we will feed you well, we won't feed you ramen noodles. Ramen noodles is a staple of the Mexican diet. And I don't know how much business they got with it, but just the fact that they did that shows you how secure they feel. Wow. Which to me raises the question, who's protecting them? Why would they feel so secure? I don't really know. I don't know about all the geopolitical forces in effect. But it's more than interesting when you really start to look into it a little deeper. When you look at just how brazen they are. To go into a rehabilitation center, a drug rehab center, and wipe out 30 or 40 people because there's one or two government witnesses in there and you don't know which one it is.
That's astonishing.
Yeah, and what it's really done to the families and the people there is just, it's horrifying.
And I haven't asked Vicky about this, but this might be a good opportunity. I don't think we've discussed it before, the whole idea about the war on drugs and what that's really about. And like a lot of people, we have always been in the crowd that says, yes, drugs should be made illegal because they hurt people. And I thought, well, that's not a victimless crime. There are victims. But what I've come to realize is that once you make drugs illegal, just like during the period of Prohibition in the United States, what you've really done is you've created a criminal class that traffics in that substance. And what you've really done is you've given the government a monopoly on that product. And there will always be corrupt military and police that will carry out the drug trade undercover. The CIA has historically been notorious for that internationally, and that's where usually the best stuff comes from, but they're not alone by any means. And so what you really have when you have a drug war going on, like Vicky's been describing, is you have the government trying to wipe out their competition.
I'm sure you've heard of the missing and murdered women of Juarez, and the best statistics I've been able to nail down, and there's so many numbers, but combination between the murdered and the missing is about 5,000 since the mid-90s. So you can just imagine what murder on that scale does to a people. just the heaviness that it creates, that they have to live under, because they don't trust their own government. You ask the average Mexican if you can really talk to them off the record. Most of them who are interested and have followed it will tell you, yes, someone in the government has to be involved, otherwise it would have stopped by now. Another thing that plays really heavily into this is the occult and Satanism. These cartels are heavily, deeply steeped in Satanism. About 3 years ago, there was a ceremony in downtown Juarez where they dedicated the city to Santa Muerta, the death saint. And that was really when the cartel murders intensified. And so this is the atmosphere then. This spiritual atmosphere is what the church there, the Christian church, has to fight. And the hopeful side to all the bad news is, I can tell you that the church is very strong, mobilized. There's a high degree of unity. And just as they had a parade and a dedication to the devil, the Pastors Association, the local church bodies, they come together. They really are unified. There's a lot of love among the people, the church, for each other and for the city. And so they will come together and they will have marches, and they will march down the streets singing hymns, singing praise songs, saying, hey, we want our city back. God bless this city.
Right.
And it really makes you realize what reality is, and that I'm not saying people in this country don't have problems, but what pass for problems in our society are really irritations, and they're not crises. But there, they really are crises that the people have learned to deal with as if they're irritations. And the church, the Christian church, the evangelical church, I guess you'd say, is really a driving force for good in that city. And I have a lot of hope for Juarez because of it, and for Mexico as a whole. That's true across the country.
One aspect of all this that, based on the question that you just answered a minute ago, we've mentioned mind control slaves before. We've mentioned Bryce Taylor and Kathy O'Brien. To get into a little bit more detail about Kathy O'Brien, a part of the way she was used as a prostitute was, and also as a courier, was to deliver messages and become close to men in Mexico who our government was trying to work deals with. And she describes NAFTA and the open borders as being crafted to allow a more free drug trade. And she also mentioned slave trade. And I haven't researched a whole lot about the slave trade, but I think many people, it's virtually everyone is familiar with the drug trade across the border, and that's a lot of the problem that Vicky has discussed. So, based on Kathy O'Brien's stories and experiences, we think that, all of a sudden we have these issues with the Mexican border. What's happening? Why did George Bush let this happen? He was a great guy. Oh, his daughter, he has a sister-in-law or something who's a Mexican citizen. Maybe he just really loves Spanish-speaking people. But evidently there was a long and detailed plan to open up the border, to allow for the CIA and other black ops who were benefiting from the drug trade to have easier access across the border. Unfortunately, this is a story that's told in many places.
Yeah, and historically, all we're really doing is pointing out contemporary versions of an age-old story, which is the ruling powers behind nations enslave people, and one of their chief ways of doing that is drugs. A famous historical example is the China Opium Wars, and that's how the British East India Company got in there, broke up the Chinese people into factions, and made them easier to manage and easier to control. And it's the same thing today. They will break down a border that way, and get people addicted, especially within the military and police. Therefore, at that point, they have introduced corruption, they have enabled the people to be easily controlled because they're addicted to the substance, and basically destroy the fabric of a nation so that a higher level of control can be, by these corrupt forces, can be brought in.
Tragic.
One of the things I thought, worth pointing out there, that from our research, one of the things we've learned is that oftentimes Satanism isn't an end in itself, and that's the way I usually thought of it as a Christian for years, was that the devil wanted to do these bad things, and then they thought that they got some kind of spiritual power out of it, and that may very well be true and true on a certain level, but a lot of the satanic ritual abuse is for the purpose of mind control. Mm-hmm. And I know that you've probably got more information on that than I do. Do you want to say something to that?
Well, I believe it's on the level of the spirit and the soul, and we're kind of wading into some deeper waters here. In Bryce Taylor's process of being made into a mind control slave, at certain times in certain ceremonies there were actually specific demonic forces that were invoked and invited to take up residence in Bryce. I believe that the power is in that realm, and it does have an effect on the realm of the spirit. And I think what you're referring to is how it impacts the soul. And regarding the soul, I would say that emotions like fear, hatred, anger, those are the buttons, so to speak, in our psyche that are being pushed by these people who wish to manipulate us.
And specifically, the fracturing of the personality that occurs is the trauma that enables the mind control to have these different alters.
Exactly.
So you've got this mechanism that is not really an end in itself, or is not really only about some kind of a demonic manifestation, but it serves a functional purpose of fracturing the personality so that personality, those different personalities in one person, can be programmed in different ways.
Sure. And while we're on the subject, we might as well mention that if you happen to be watching us because you're hired to or whatever, we'd like to invite you to leave behind this dark and terrifying world. You have the ability. You are the one who has control over your soul and your spirit, and you can make decisions. And if you would happen to be a mind control victim, or begin to question that possibly you've been a mind control victim, we would like to invite you to get in touch with us. We know of Christian ministries who are able to bring restoration and healing, and you don't have to stay where you are. There are people who will house you and protect you. And one of the ministries is actually called Shabar, and Shabar is taken from the Hebrew word for shattered, and it's typically translated broken-hearted. Shattered people are referred to as broken-hearted, but the word actually means what Don addressed, that your soul has been shattered and broken into various pieces, and there are people who have the ability, the knowledge, and the desire to help you to be restored and to become whole again.
Great. Thank you.
If we're finished with that discussion, we'll go from very heavy to somewhat lighter, and move into Pearl Culture, our discussion of modern culture and how it affects us, how we can affect it. And we'll just briefly mention, maybe it won't be so brief, it was a 3-hour experience. The three of us watched The Power of Nightmares, and it's a film that was produced by the BBC, so to some extent it's a mainstream media production, but quite insightful. We felt that it didn't go quite deep enough, but very insightful regarding how societies are manipulated, what Don was discussing a little earlier. So, either of you care to comment on The Power of Nightmares?
I loved it. It was really informative, sort of a primer of a wide scope of everything that's happened in the last, 30 years maybe, since the mid-70s. Actually, it went back further than that, to some of the early Muslim radicals, but for people who are just starting to get their feet wet in the truther movement, or starting to learn about some of the banker stuff, it would be an excellent resource.
I always tell people, if they don't understand the difference between a neocon and a conservative, to watch The Power of Nightmares, because that's, I think, what they present real clearly is how the neocon agenda is a specific fear-based agenda and a specific fear-based strategy that was brought into our culture to manipulate with fear in order to bring the United States into foreign wars and to be feeling like we had to attack these people because they were so bad. Of course, we addressed this issue earlier. It ties into that same idea. So the whole fear-based mentality is very well done in that movie.
Perfect love casts out all fear.
Amen.
We also wanted to touch on social media in light of what's been happening with Charlie Sheen and Alex Jones. Charlie started a Twitter account and gained, I forget, Don knows how many followers in a very brief period of time.
1 million followers in one day.
And we ourselves use social media, and Don has some great insights regarding how social media has impacted our culture, as well as, more specifically, the truther movement. So, can you comment?
Sure. Also, I want to mention that the social media, such as Twitter and Facebook, are being used prominently in these revolutions that are occurring in the Middle East. And as we mentioned in previous broadcasts, these revolutions are real but also scripted. So what's happening is there's this high-tech overlay that's coming onto a culture that is attempting to be used by the powers that be to manipulate the people to go in certain directions. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. What I think we're finding is that, as I think we mentioned last week, maybe we didn't, that maybe that was a new development this week, that Hillary Clinton has actually said we're losing the information war. And when she said that, what she was referring to was, as the people that we were losing to were Al Jazeera, Russia Today, other foreign media, feeling like we should get more funding for our American and Western corporate media. She wasn't really talking about the social networking media, but behind the scenes she was, because what happens in the social media, social networking media like Facebook and Twitter, you get a lot of liberty and truth activists that are tapping into these other sources like Russia Today and Al Jazeera, and interviews with major celebrities or political leaders, kind of thing that We Are Change does, which is a great organization. And you get this network of people spreading truth. And the more that people become aware of that, the more that they also see that we're being fed lies and we're living in this 1984 world that we didn't think was, we thought was reality, but we find out it isn't. So social media is becoming very, very powerful. There are growing networks of truther and liberty-minded people, which sometimes the boundaries overlap, sometimes they don't, and that's okay, that's good. What you have is a very real spectrum of opinion that is not easily divided into left versus right. And just experiencing that world can be a revelation, because then you see how manipulated the mainstream media reality is. So we utilize those tools as our primary mechanism for following current events, find out what's happening in the world, is these networks of Facebook and Twitter people and YouTube videos, etc. And we encourage you to do that as well. So there's different Twitter platforms, different Facebook platforms. I won't get into a whole lot of detail now, but we've been looking and searching for ones that really help us, and there's things that we've learned that we'd be glad to dialogue with you offline to help you get your feet wet and begin to tap into these things. And then, of course, on the Pearls of Liberty website, or if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see it on the screen, the different things that you can connect to with us on Facebook and Twitter, and help get you oriented in this world.
Another film that we happened to watch this week is an oldie but a goodie that we revisited. The film Network from 1976. And what a great film.
It's amazing.
Vicky, do you have anything to say about Network?
I think it'd be really good, even if you haven't seen it, you need to see it, but even if you have, to get it out and see how incredibly prescient and prophetic almost the makers of that film were in light of our world today. It's pretty amazing.
It is truly remarkable, and if you do watch it, we hope that you'll take special note of the speech that Ned Beatty's character gave to Howard Beale to get him to support corporations and allow the elite to do
down
what they
to the
want to
level of him saying that Howard Beale had derailed something and he needed to atone, and that was he was meddling in the primal forces of nature that were the Arab oil nations, OPEC, and as it was called in those days. And it doesn't explain this in the film, but we were buying their oil in exchange for their buying the U.S. Treasury bills, and that is what is and has been financing our economy. And this was somebody upsetting this through this activism of that day, and those were actually issues that were in discussion, and there was more awareness in the popular culture of that day about the way the world really works than there is now. So you can not only see the prophetic nature of the film, but also realize that there were some real issues that were dealt with in a fictional form in that film that were part of the understanding of the culture of the day that we have lost sight of because the powers that be don't want us to know about them.
That's true, and in fact, one thing that I noticed, though we don't watch television news, to my memory from the last time I did, one thing that was mentioned in Network was they regularly told how many homicides there were, how many breaking and enterings there were. I don't believe even that kind of information is released on the news anymore. We don't. When we were growing up, it's sad, it's unfortunate, but we very regularly saw the battles in Vietnam. We were shown the people being hurt and what was happening. That was all on the news. it doesn't seem very typical anymore to see much of the battles in the Middle East or the other places that our men are fighting.
They wouldn't even allow the body bags to be filmed when during the Bush administration. And those the bodies of slain soldiers were brought back. The media was so controlled that they were not allowed to film them.
And considering what's happening in Iraq and what's been happening, we're so outraged over the Nazi prison camps, as we should be. But there were between 3 and 6 million people who were put to death in those prison camps. And we have killed over 1 million Iraqis. And you consider the size of Iraq, it's not a huge country. That's proportionately, that's a very large number of people. And nobody really talks much about that.
I can't remember the exact figures, but it would be like a 9/11 event occurring every day for, I think it was over 100 years. Based on the proportion of the population. So I'm not even saying that the two events are related, but I'm just trying to put the whole situation in magnitude. We just don't hear about 1 million Iraqis being killed.
And we accept so much without question. So our plea to you is ask questions. Don't be satisfied even with what we tell you. Go on your own quest, go on your own search for knowledge. Don't give up until you're satisfied. Don't get tired. Don't get scared. Just press through. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free.
And we need all kinds of people in all kinds of areas. We're nearing the tipping point of something really, really big, and that's a major upheaval in our society. And it's going to take people that have understanding of different areas in which we have fallen, in which we have dropped the ball, and in which we've been less than vigilant in upholding liberty, in order to put this thing back together again in a way that is truly representative of the people in a modern society. And that's going to take a lot of work by a lot of people. So don't leave it to the experts. Get involved. There is something for you to do.
Great. Vicky, thank you so much for joining us. And we both thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for another week. We'll look forward to seeing you next week and online.
Absolutely.